Thank you all very much for being here. It's gratifying, but in some ways not very surprising that a talk on food should be popular. So welcome to what is perhaps not always mundane, but very often that daily thing that we do that's also completely extraordinary, because it is in fact something that unites and connects pretty well every aspect of human existence. And in some ways that's what this project, the Eco-Gastronomy project, was about. It was trying to think in a new way and do in a new way research on food and food systems that had to acknowledge that every single thing that happens on the planet is in some way connected to food, particularly when we're talking about humans who necessarily have to ingest food in order to accomplish anything that they do on the planet. So starting with that as an idea that food is highly complex and yet simplified in many ways to make it easy for us to just get through the day, eat our meals, and not think about it too much, I launched off on this project. And today marks the end of the project, effectively. It was about 18 months ago that I started it in Italy. And this is the last event. This is the last of about 30 events that I have participated in. And so it's really a wonderful experience for me to come home to Montreal, to share these stories, and to reflect on them, and then hopefully also to have you reflect on some of the things that I've said and talk. Or your own perspectives, your own critiques of the food world that you live in, your own admiration of the food things that you love. So think about those things as I'm talking, because what I'm here to do is not tell you in an authoritative manner how food is, but to share some stories and hopefully to inspire you to share your stories as well every day with other people, because talking about our food is one way to make it a better kind of system. I work for the University of Gastronomic Sciences. This is an institution that was co-founded in Italy about 13, 14 years ago now, co-founded by Slow Food International, which is a movement towards making the food world a better, cleaner, happier, safer place for all of us. And the university is very much about training a new generation of food scholars, food activists, perhaps food artists, in thinking, but also doing and feeling and sensing how food is. At the University of Gastronomic Sciences, we bring it all together. And we say, oh, by the way, also the emotions and the sense of taste and smell and vision and sound. That's all part of learning about food, too. So it's very experiential. And that experiential learning process about food is what transforms the students there. There are now, I think, 3 graduates of the University of Gastronomic Sciences in this room right here. I'm one of them, and there are 2 others who may or may not put up their hands to identify themselves. But we learned that when you do and think and feel food simultaneously, something quite radical happens, particularly to what needs to happen in the world afterwards. Once you're transformed, you want to go and transform the world around you. And so taking that ethos of the university and putting it out broadly into the world was what the Eco-Gastronomy project was about. It was an attempt to share ideas, not tell other people our perspective, not to be an expert in food, because I'm certainly not an expert in your food. I'm knowledgeable about some things, but not in what you like, how you act, what you believe in, what your ethics are. So it's very much about exchange and sharing. And that's also somewhat unusual in the academic world, where people are often the authority, the expert. I was trying not to be an expert. And though it was me doing the traveling around, what I was more interested in doing was activating conversations, like hopefully we'll have later on today. There were sort of 3 underlying ethoses for this project. One was to create value. And that's a bit abstract, but by that we meant create value for the individuals who are participating in the events, create value for the partners that I organize the events with, create value for the University of Gastronomic Sciences, but also broadly create value for the idea of gastronomy. The second ethos was to sort of draw attention differently to food. And that's the eco part. There's a French philosopher, sociologist, psychologist called Félix Guattari who talks about the 3 ecologies of human existence, and bringing those together is a way to move forward sustainably in the world. And I was very inspired by this idea of 3 ecologies, and actually started thinking about multiple ecologies. So in his framing, it's the ecology of the self, the individual person, the ecology of society, that's a lot of people together, and the ecology of what we generally call the environment, which is that stuff outside. But I started thinking about the ecology of language, the ecology of communication, the ecology of materials, the ecologies of interaction. And this is just broadening the idea of ecology a bit. So it was also very experimental, and that was the third ethos. How can we do food research, have food events, exchange ideas about food in perhaps new ways, or ways that we haven't already pre-constructed? How can we just be experimental and not know where we're going? And so it was very much about discovering new ways of interacting around food, discovering how we can pay attention to food differently, how the symbolic meaning can take precedence, or the material value can take precedence, or the economic value can be present without dominating the other parts of food. As I did this, I learned about what was truly valuable to me was telling stories, was making individual points of connection, not trying to be universal about knowledge of food, but to try to just show people how they are connected to their own worlds, how I might be connected to them, how this project might be connected to other worlds and other systems of value. And so individual points of connection became very important, and I tried to activate that through storytelling. And that's what I'm doing today. That's why I'm telling stories instead of giving an academic, formal, rigorous, scientific presentation. I don't believe in that so much for food. I much more prefer to have the subjective ideas, the ways that I feel, the stories of the people that I met, have them be communicative and important and legitimate academically, and also legitimately important for all of us, whether or not we practice academia. So as I said, this all started in September. When I went to, September a year and a half ago, when I went to Milan and went to this site, which is Expo Milano, it was all about food this year. It was about focusing attention on different ways that we can produce food. And it was a complicated event, as all world expos are. There were a lot of pavilions there from a lot of countries. Canada was not there. Our then Prime Minister, Stephen Harper, decided it wasn't worth participating in, spending the millions and millions of dollars it takes and creating the carbon footprint. And, don't agree with him on all aspects of the world, but in this case, I thought maybe it's a good thing not to go to this event, because what this event showed me was there's a lot of talk about feeding 9 billion people. That's the dominant rhetoric right now with this sort of governmental scale of food production. And it kind of ignores a lot of the other stuff that goes on underneath that big umbrella of rhetoric. And so as I went through this expo, I thought, what else is underneath that umbrella? And what can we learn as we start moving along? So I'm going to go through this project chronologically. I'm going to tell you some stories that happened to me, very personal stories, very immediate stories. I'm not going to try to be an expert on other people's stories. I'm going to tell you what happened to me, because I think that's the only story I have the right to tell. And as I have done more and more of this research, I've come to realize that sometimes it can be tempting to say authoritatively, this is the way things are, and yet I don't know how things are, I just know what happened to me and what I witnessed. So we started in South Korea, in Seoul, in and around Seoul actually, in the region, the town called Goyang, which is northwest of Seoul, and was the site of an exhibition that we were participating in collectively. And the first thing I learned when I got to Korea, our driver, who's also one of the leaders of slow food in Korea, said to me, David, one thing you need to know before you start anything. In Korea, food equals medicine. We believe that. Like, okay, that's interesting. That's a complicated notion to unpack if you think about what medicine is and how that's implicated in industry and politics and health and wellness. Food equals medicine. Okay. And so we went to this, what you're seeing here is a small segment of what's called a royal banquet. And this was hot pot with some vegetables, some kimchi, the side dishes, banchan that also go with Korean meals, and then a huge array of mushrooms and a few root vegetables in there as well. But there were about 18 or 19 or 20 different things, and some of them were, of course, foods I'd never seen or eaten before. But I ate them, and I ate them quite happily, and I was thinking, oh, it's great to start sensing oneself through smell and through taste. And so I started becoming aware of my presence in Korea as anchored to the smells and tastes that were around me. And so we ate this, and fascinating. We had some green tea, and we talked a lot. And there were about 150 of us at this event. So we were having little conversations. And at a certain moment, the meal moved on to the next course, and they brought out what they were calling male rice and female rice. I thought, okay, I'm a kind of, I think, progressive, feminist, Western kind of guy. Male rice, female rice. This is challenging some of my notions of what gender equality is all about. And we were explained that some of the rices had ingredients that were designed to inspire and energize and heat up the body, which one might want for one gender or the other. And the other rice was there to cool the passions and calm things down. And so in conventional framings of gender, you can imagine probably which rice was for which. And I thought, food equals medicine, huh? So I took a bite of both of them and waited for the effects to take place. I don't know if they did, but it was entertaining enough. But it started making me think about food and medicine, food and gender in whole other ways. These are images of some of the massive numbers of fermenting and infusing jars that this restaurant had in their upstairs workshop. And there were, as you can probably guess, lots of things there that I'd never seen before in my life, and was fascinated to know what might be lurking in those. I didn't find out, but what this picture reminds me of is there's a lot of tastes and influences and medicines that are worth thinking about as we go through our world. This gentleman was a guy I met at the exhibition, and he is a curator of ongi, these giant fermentation vessels. And I was fascinated because I am also a potter, and so I make ceramics, and so I was very interested in the ceramic aspects of this. But he started telling me about the history of ongi and the important nature they serve, because of course ongi is what kimchi is made in, what banchan, which a number of different condiments are made in. And another woman who was here, who's actually just off to the left of this picture, then showed me pictures on her phone of these ongi lining the hillsides in the countryside of Korea, where over the winter time and the cool temperatures of South Korea, the kimchi ferment very, very slowly. But it was magnificent, these fields of up to 500 ongi. They're big like this. And they were just sitting out there on the hillside, a bit like an arboretum or a giant field of grass growing, but they were fermentation growing. And that play between the very intimate qualities of fermented food, which are all about bacteria and the microbiome and the little tiny creatures that we live with constantly and that live in us and that keep us human, keep us alive, but then also this magnificent giant macro landscape of the environment. And those two things have a relationship, and then we have a relationship with both of them. So I started thinking about medicine and food in a different way, coming back to ecology and balance and the ways that we swallow each other, microbes, environments, and people. From Korea, I did a mad dash back to Montreal, and about a week later went to Mexico City, where the climate was quite different, both in terms of temperature and food, and also what was in the air. Actually, that was quite common. Mexico City is fantastically polluted in terms of air quality. Huge amounts of traffic, particularly at this time when I was there, which was just before Christmas, which is when everyone's driving around doing shopping and various commercial activities. Seoul also inundated by a lot of smog from the mainland of China. So smog was a constant theme there. But in Mexico, we were organizing an event around ethics and food and small-scale entrepreneurship in the city. And as many of you are no doubt very aware, Mexico is a country that's facing huge numbers of problems with institutionalized corruption and violence. And so as a small food entrepreneur, one of my colleagues from the university, who is now an entrepreneur there, he had to face some of these issues of how is he going to set up a business, not pay the bribes, which is going to slow down the business, which is going to make him outside of a community of other relationships, because those were his ethics. And so that was the beginning point of a conversation that led to what we did, which was a roundtable on food and ethics and entrepreneurship. But one of the first things I noticed when I got to Mexico City was the massive quantity of street food. And we here in Montreal are lucky to have some street food coming into our communities now, but it's nothing like what they have in Mexico City. And so from about 6 o'clock in the morning, these kinds of trucks are starting to set themselves up, and they last on the street all day long. There are large trucks and small trucks, kiosks. I saw one woman who was standing in front of a brazier about this big, cooking tortillas, I think. She was standing here. Her space was about, 4 square feet, and she stood there for 8 hours making tortillas, and that was her food stand. And there's this huge amount of food consumed in the street, so the smells are very present. But the reality that food is part of the day-to-day life doesn't get hidden away into people's kitchens and into restaurants and into supermarkets. It's there. It's really present. And that was the first thing that struck me. Second thing that struck me was this wonderful woman, a woman called Georgina Yescas. And she's a cheese entrepreneur. And she's a friend of another alumna from the University of Gastronomic Sciences. And with her brother, she's opened this cheese shop cheese business called Lactography. And they have a cheese shop in a very trendy market in Mexico City. And she gave me a cheese tasting. And as she was telling me about the cheeses, she was really telling me about the cheese makers. Because her job, as she sees it, is to support very small scale, mostly female cheesemakers in the countryside surrounding Mexico City. Why is this? Well, women in Mexico do not always have the easiest time, both because of also institutionalized sexism, but because of the value that's given to women's work. And so what Heo wanted to do was listen to them, hear their stories, and also give them some ideas about new cheeses to make. Because in Mexico, there's a huge number of very European-style cheeses being produced, and very few of the traditional, much more local recipes which exist, but aren't commercially manufactured, and which people don't know about. So Heo's there supporting cheesemakers, giving them ideas, and in fact, one of the cheeses that she recommended that one cheesemaker make has become an international award winner in the, now I forget, it's the Mondial of cheeses around the planet. So she's creating change for individuals, but she's also creating change in a very specific way at the larger scale of cheese. So our event eventually took place. This is related to the event. Because it was around Christmas, we decided to have both this very serious roundtable about ethics and also a very joyous celebration of Christmas. And this was part of the Navidad festivities. There are reenactments, as it were, of the Jesus and Mary and Joseph. I'm a Jew, I don't know about these things. Of the Mary and Joseph story. And so as part of the lead up to Christmas, there are these singing practices, and people come and you're welcomed into other people's houses. And it's a little bit like Halloween, where you knock knock, except you're singing instead of saying trick or treat, and you're welcomed in for food. So we thought we'd combine this tradition with the tradition of the non-tradition of talking about ethics in food in Mexico City. The content of the panel was very interesting and very important, but what was remarkable to me was one story that happened at the end of this meal, at the end of this event. After we'd smashed the piñata and after we'd gathered up the treats, a new colleague who I had just met said, "David, this is amazing." And I thought, yeah, it was a pretty good event, wasn't it? She said, no, I'm going home with Alberto and Donna. It's like, okay, that's nice. I'm getting a ride with them. Good. No, you don't understand. We don't go home with strangers in Mexico City. We don't accept rides from people we don't know. This is unheard of. This is a violent city. You don't know who you're getting into a car with. And even after an event, you wouldn't go home with somebody because nobody really trusts each other. But something seems to have happened tonight. Something seems to have changed. I trust them. They trust me. I would never do this in another condition. But that changed for me tonight, so thank you. And I was thinking about it over and over in the months that came. And I still don't know what it is about food and sharing and talking about this thing that crosses throughout all of our lives that led to a moment of, in this case, unprecedented trust between two people, three people. The answer's not there, and there's no way to scientifically prove that anything happened. But it was pretty remarkable, I thought. Went on to Singapore. Once again, a remarkably different place than either of the other two. And Singapore is known for its huge variety of street food, multi-Asian food, Malaysian food, Chinese food, Indian food, foods from all around Southeast and South Asia. And it's all eaten, once again, very publicly in hawker centers, these kind of giant food courts that are very inexpensive, that are subsidized for the most part by government. So it's very, very affordable food for the people. One of the famous dishes of Singapore is Hainanese chicken rice, or Singapore chicken rice, which, as you can see, is a pretty simple looking dish. It's rice, it's chicken, there's some condiments, there's some spicy sauces. And one of my students at the University of Gastronomic Sciences wrote about this for me once. He said, "Oh, David, I'm going to write about Singapore chicken rice because I really want to tell you how good it is." And he wrote what was not really a very interesting piece of text about Singapore chicken rice. Okay, I'm glad you love it. Why do you love it? I didn't get that from what you wrote. And he said, "No, it's just that it's so good." It's like, all right, can you describe the components? Well, there's chicken and there's rice and the sauce. Well, which one? It's just, I like it. Yeah, okay, great. So keep doing what you do. He's a wine guy. He's not a food writer. Fabulous. He's really good at what he does. So that you don't need to be a food writer. I admire this. A couple of years later, I'm in Singapore, and here we are sitting down having some Singapore chicken rice. I ate it, and I was like, this is good. What is it about it that I like so much? Or just it's just that it's good. And so as this moment happened for me 2 years later, I started to realize just how accurate the student's writing had been. Largely because it was, for him and for me, at this point now, impossible to put into words, into text, what it is about food. So once again, it's another unanswered question that has come to me. But it's made me think a lot more about doing this. Instead of trying to use descriptors of taste to try to communicate why something might be so very good. That was really good. Soft-boiled egg marinated in sweet soy sauce that I bought at the Kmart, not far from the bed and breakfast I was staying in. Never thought I'd eat food at a Kmart in Singapore. But it turns out the food at Kmart's in Singapore, and curiously in Oslo, is very good. One of the other pieces of work that we did in Singapore was a storytelling and sensory performance workshop with some art students at the LaSalle College of the Arts. And we wanted the students to start, who were basically practiced in visual arts, basically good at painting and sculpture and drawing, photography. And we wanted to help them think through more of their senses than the eyes about how to communicate exciting stuff about food. So we had this 2-day workshop, my colleague Carmen and I, and we, at the end of it, helped them stage a showcase of their work. And over the course of 2 days, just by saying, what if you thought about the smell of movement, or the sound of chocolate, or the texture of light? And we started messing around with their conventional ideas about the senses. These students did some amazing work. And so I just wanted to show a couple of the snapshots of the moments from that work. These two students, in doing a durational performance of about 1 hour and 15 minutes, in which they first dirtied rice and then cleaned it and then dirtied it and cleaned it in a continuing cycle. The dirt was actually black paint. And as they performed this ongoing, perpetual gesture of dirtying and cleaning and dirtying and cleaning, having been inspired by the very complicated question of how humans both dirty their environment and then take from their environment food, which comes into their homes, so they can clean it, they were demonstrating this sort of futility of how we as humans are continually messing up the environment from which we hope to draw clean food. So they did this, and it was quite beautiful, the gestures and the movement, the photography. I would suspect that most people coming along would not quite get what was going on. But the more important thing was that they got it. And so these two students who have now embodied this sense of movement and gesture and the emotionality of desperately cleaning up rice and desperately dirtying it again and desperately cleaning it and desperately dirtying it have now come to anchor in themselves a knowledge about food and about this larger issue of the environment that I can describe, but I don't even quite understand it as well as they do now. Another student wanted to create a tableau of food just to see what would happen. She didn't know where she was going. She had a lot of food. She spread it out on a table, and again, for about an hour and a half, she did this thing. What was lovely about that for me was she didn't know where she was going. And it serves as a great model for research, not to try to get to an objective, but to explore. This final performance reduced me to tears. And Cheng-Hua had talked a little bit about the underlying story, which is the death of her father, his love of a certain kind of cookie, and her sense of loss. That's kind of it. But as she went through this very ritualized performance of sitting, contemplating, not moving, walking, throwing these pieces of paper in the air, sitting, eating the paper, and then coming back to her starting point, I felt and knew I was crying just because of the intensity of her gestures. And so once again I thought, how can we do something with that? How can food be expressed? And then I thought, wait a minute, it already is expressed. Every time we eat and we do those gestures, every time my student says, how important is gesture? How important is it to pay attention to someone's gestures and movements and facial expressions and tensions as they eat, as they talk about food, as they make food? Need to pay more attention. From Singapore, because of a very wonderful, unexpected point of connection, I went to Dili in Timor-Leste, which most of us in this room may know better as East Timor, as a country at the eastern tip of the Indonesian archipelago, a country that was colonized by the Portuguese about 400 years ago, that was occupied by the Americans and the Japanese during World War II, that was invaded by the Indonesian army, and that has suffered just an extraordinary history of violence and turmoil and death and damage, and is now in a period of relative peace. Why would I go to this place without knowing clearly what I was doing? Well, it was because sitting across from me at that Korean banquet was a woman called Alva Lim. And when I said I was going to Singapore in an announcement from the university, she said, "Hey, David, come to Dili. There are flights, direct flights. It's really easy." And I said, "Great, I'll come to Dili. We'll do something there." Well, it turns out the direct flights are $1,800, and they only go 3 times a week, and it's a lot further than I thought. Oh, and Timor-Leste is absolutely chock full of mosquito-borne viruses. I forgot to pack any bug repellent. Just hadn't a clue. But I said, yeah, sure. And because I said, yeah, sure, and because when we started talking about what we could do in this single, unusual point of connection, I came to have, for me, the most transformative experience of this whole project, which is the country of Timor-Leste. Newly independent, the second youngest country on the planet, period of relative stability. Of course, guess what's happening? All the multinationals are viewing it as a new resource to both exploit and into which to sell their products. So the number one food in Timor right now is what they call super mee, which we know as cup noodles. It's the biggest international food on the planet, biggest user of palm oil. Really complicated, really non-nutritious food. And yet it's hugely popular. Well, it used to be that people ate rice, and before that they ate cracked corn. And before that they ate a whole bunch of other things that were local to the island. This is the Taibesi market, which is huge, bigger than Jean Talon, way more biodiverse. I've never seen so much food of different varieties anywhere on the planet. In this island nation of 1 million people, they speak 45 distinct dialects. It's incredibly biodiverse in terms of its culture and its food. And yes, cracked corn is still eaten, but there's Alva, what my new friends there have started to do is to contribute to the nation-building project of Timor-Leste through the food. By recognizing, valorizing, celebrating, singing about, making, eating food from Timor in a regular day-to-day way. Not making it a big special event, just doing it. And one of the ways they started to do it was by creating this map, this visualization of the island. And you can see the map down here. And what they did is they brought farmers and activists and artists and eaters all together, and they said, okay, let's make a map of Timor using the food of the places of Timor. And so for months, they argued, no, this kind of coffee doesn't grow in this part. No, when I was growing up, there was only that kind of avocado there, so we need to put this here, but not there. And what they did was they had a conversation. And this visualization activated that conversation because they had to debate, they had to argue, they had to agree and disagree about what came from where. And in doing that, they made a map. But much more importantly, they made themselves. They remembered from times before violence or even during violence. They remembered about their food, and it made them remember who they always were. And maybe if they keep doing that, and they are doing that because Alva and her partner have instituted this as a process in their food, in their cafe and food studio, they're going to keep telling their stories of their food. Is that going to help them resist the international food coming in, the Burger Kings and the Super Me? Maybe. Is it going to create a kind of balance with it? Maybe. So that's what's happening there through storytelling and conversation. At a certain point, I went off to Eastern and Northern Europe. We called it the north of 50 because I was always north of the 50th latitude. And in Poland, in Wrocław, which is a very interesting, strange city in Lower Silesia that used to be German, that used to be Bohemian, that used to be part of the Austro-Hungarian Empire, that is now part of Poland. In this town, they have what are called milk bars, which are not so much focused on dairy, but basically not focused on meat. And these milk bars were originally constructed as a way to feed the working class in a relatively inexpensive way. The food is subsidized and the food is local. And there's very little meat. So it keeps the costs low, and because it's supporting local agriculture, there's a government investment. And the food is very good. The food is, we often make fun of Polish food as being stodgy, but this food was anything but stodgy. It was fresh, and this was a cucumber soup that was incredibly refreshing and full of flavor. The cucumber was distinct. The potatoes were just some of the best potatoes I've ever had. It's not served in a fancy way. You can see it's plastic cutlery, plastic bowls. You generally sit outside. But the remarkable thing for me about these milk bars is that everyone eats there. They were conceived for the working class, but now it's students, wealthy, middle class, homeless people, and the workers, all communing in a single place. And this is rare in our food existence. Generally, we don't sit down at tables with people from distinctly different socioeconomic classes. We tend to be among our people, including in our supermarkets and in our dépanneurs and all these things, because that's how we basically operate. But in Wrocław and in other towns in Poland, there is this remarkable crossing of communities. It doesn't mean everybody likes each other or gets along, but they encounter each other. They're not visible. And so food, in this way, makes visible the whole crossing of strata in the community. One of the things, that's a happy cow in Oslo, or outside of Oslo. But one of the things that then happened to me when I got to Norway was, first of all, I was hosted by the incredibly generous Anna Siri. She's another former student, of course, because the network of friends is ever expanding from the university. But I was hosted by her for about a week, and by another of our colleagues, another peer from the university. And one of the things that happened is that we ate an enormous number of meals around her little kitchen table. One of them included this, which is a beautiful dish of smoked reindeer heart and cured whale. And you can imagine how I might have felt sitting down to this incredibly generous gift of smoked reindeer heart and cured whale. The cured whale came from Francisco, who had got it from a whaler who had cured it himself. The smoked reindeer hearts came from some friends of Anasiri who are Sami, who are the northern people of Scandinavia, or of that large peninsula. They're the reindeer people. They hunt and they herd, and live with the reindeer. And the heart is prized, and so Anasiri had been gifted with a few of these hearts, which she then took into her backyard in downtown Oslo and smoked in a little illegal smoker in her backyard. So this was very personal food. And I was, of course, very interested to taste both of it. And I ate the whale. I thought, wow, this is amazingly good tasting in my mouth. And as I heard the story of its production, and then as I later on went and found out more about the politics of its production, it started to taste good in my mind as well. Because like here in Quebec and Newfoundland and Labrador, there's a very complicated, long history of this practice of whaling in Norway. Norway is the only country to have opted out of the European agreement to banning whaling. And it's contentious. And lots of people who I've told that I've eaten cured whale meat have gotten very angry at me for killing a beautiful animal. This is a practice that goes back thousands of years, like sealing here. This is a practice that is very misunderstood by people outside of the community who do it. And this is a practice that is really complicated to try to wrap your head around. So in eating, it triggered me to try to start wrapping my head a little bit more around this and to try to find a parallel that made sense to me. And when I ate the whale, I remember the time I ate some seal, and I thought, oh, okay, I get this better. So sometimes the embodiment of the scary is a good way to make it less scary. Lots of people would disagree with me, and that's, I think, also part of the beauty of food. That's a seagull egg. That's a seagull egg cooked for 3 minutes and served on some local asparagus with a wild garlic vinaigrette. That's all I'll say about that, but it was really good. So I then went on to Dublin, which is a great center of storytelling, and we told a lot of stories about food. But I started my night in Dublin at Trinity College in the center of town, and I went out to my favorite place to go food shopping anywhere in the world, which is Marks and Spencer's. Because at Marks and Spencer's you can get Welsh cakes, you can get 4 cheese and red onion flavored crinkly potato chips, and you can get the remarkably named spicy and fragrant Bombay mix. And next door to the Marks and Spencer's was a liquor store, and I had read in one of the abstracts of the conference that I was going to about this fascinating drink called poitín. And poitín is moonshine. It's the historic Irish, roughly fermented beverage that can be made with almost anything. It's booze made at home. But there's been a resurgence of poitín in Ireland now, in the production and the making it in interesting ways that are not quite as toxic as the old historic ways. And so I bought a bottle of poitín, and I had for my first night in Dublin a meal made of these delightfully well-paired, I'll tell you, very well-paired comestibles. And then that kicked off a much more serious engagement with some of the local realities of food in Ireland, some of the theoretic and philosophical stuff that I wanted to talk about with my colleagues there, and it continued on and on. I also learned a little bit about the history that links Ireland and Quebec. This is a noggin, which is a traditional small vessel. It's about, whatever that is, about 5 inches, 10 centimeters across. And it's a little cup or ladle for dipping into the communal pot of food, maybe porridge, maybe milk, maybe yogurt, and you would then also drink and eat from it. And Irish people would carry them with them everywhere because it was a convenient way to both serve and eat food. And as the immigrant communities came to Canada and other places, they would bring their noggin with them. And it was a very personal, it was like always having the possibility of eating food because you always had a thing that you could dip into a communal pot. And the story of the noggin that I heard was very inspiring about the sense of personal object and food security. In some ways, even if you didn't have food to put in it, having it with you would be maybe a reminder that food was going to come again. So I will move through Toronto. Did a fun workshop at OCAD University in Toronto on sandwich making and thesis questions. That can be a question I'll answer later if anyone's still interested. I then got to Quito in Ecuador. And Quito is a very high city. It's about, it's almost 3 miles up. And I got really sick. I was dehydrated. I got taken to the hospital. My blood pressure dropped to 90/60 and then went up to 180/150. And that's a food story. Because, not just because of what I might have ingested that made me sick, but because what actually happened is the event that I co-organized with 4 students and alumni of the University of Gastronomic Sciences was an event that I could not participate in because I was, honestly, vomiting. And I had to go back to my room while the students took over the event and ran it beautifully. And they had a panel of 6 speakers, and they had a series of tastings of some traditional Ecuadorian beverages. I was very upset that I didn't get to taste those things made from fermented corn and fresh corn and fruit juices, all sorts of interesting beverages in Ecuador. But the most powerful thing for me about this event was not the content, but was the fact that when I disappeared, when my power as a leader of an event or a director of a research program evaporated, someone else came in to occupy that space and did it better than I could have. And so this was very much a moment for me that solidified the idea that when the expert shuts up, something else might happen. And that something is very important for all of us to recognize, because all of us wield power in our own worlds, whether we're a grandmother cooking for our families, whether we're a teacher, whether we're a food purchaser for a supermarket chain, whether we're a writer, a blogger, a photographer. We wield a lot of power over the ways that we communicate and that we act. What if we didn't do that one day? What else might happen? And so I say that as I'm standing in front of a room of people, and you're all facing me, and I'm facing you, and I've got control over the computer. I do have a lot of power in this particular moment. But it made me start thinking about the times when I might put down power relative to food and how that might be valuable for the world around me. This, I'll suggest that you take a look at this video that's on the table out there. This man makes what are called colaciones. And they're small. This is his workshop, very simple. He's been there or he hasn't been there, but the shop has been there for 101 years. They're peanuts coated in sugar syrup and toasted over this brazier. He shakes this pan back and forth for 3 hours to make a single batch of these things, and ends up with maybe a couple of kilos. So you see he's wearing this Che Guevara t-shirt. On the wall just to, well, the left as we're looking at him, but his right, are all the newspaper clippings of him in his Che Guevara t-shirt making colaciones, shaking the pan for 3 hours. So it's incredibly heavy, long, exhausting, not very well paid work. It's incredibly important in terms of the food traditions of Quito. It's incredibly well mediatized. And I started thinking, oh, look at this. How the media, and this image of the man in his t-shirt shaking his pan, those images in the media now kind of anchor him into this role. He has to do this. He has to be there. He can't change the pan. He can't improve the technology to reduce his labor, because it makes the images that the media has produced about him no longer true, and this doesn't become a tourist destination. And then someone like me doesn't come along and take a picture of him because he's not doing it the same way he used to do it for 101 years. So this interesting question about the intersections of tradition and innovation came to me in this moment, and how sometimes tradition locks out innovation, how tradition punishes those who practice it, because sometimes tradition is bloody exhausting. But tradition is not just something that we do, it's something that people say we do, like newspapers and food academics. In Minneapolis, it was all about sustainability. Lots of stories on the table. Fantastic work going on with reimagining sustainability, not as keeping things going, but dealing with what we already have, dealing with climate change in a positive way, rather than trying to stop it. It's not maybe the only answer, but it's another answer. And then in Portland, Oregon, we did this thing. I don't think anyone else has named it this, but we call it a heritage recipe slam, like a poetry slam, where people stand up and tell not poems, but their family recipes. We had 11 people stand up and tell their family recipes. This woman was telling about her nukazuke. I'm saying it with an Italian accent. Japanese pickles, nukazuke. And that's her pot full of rice bran and an actively fermenting substrate. And so she makes pickles in this. But she's constructed this, and she's keeping it going and continually making pickles, which is how you keep the microbes alive. It's how you feed your family with delicious pickles. And she's doing it partly for herself for the now, and she's doing it partly for her son, who will inherit this culture and make his own pickles for his own family in his lifetime. And then he will keep it alive for his daughter or son or whoever else will inherit it from him. And so as we smelled this extraordinary, rich, fermenty smell, started thinking about traditional recipes, family recipes, telling of recipes as a continual cycle of sharing and preserving something, but also creating the next generation of it for the families that come afterwards. We told these stories. We each had different stories to tell, and at the same time, we had two cooks making their own food stories in the background. And this woman, a muralist named Ursula Barton, who paints landscapes and cityscapes, mostly of Portland, Oregon, because she loves the city. We asked her to paint the foodscape at this particular event. And so as we were telling our stories about pickles and sausages and meatballs and cheese spreads, Ursula was painting what she was hearing. And at the end, we came away with two large-scale paintings that were another version of the stories that had happened. And then we ate together, of course, because we had to eat. And Kumi, who's one of the professional cooks, had made this beautiful bowl of congee rice porridge with spicy tomato and avocado sauce. She's from Arizona, and her ethnic heritage is Indian, and she now lives in Portland. So she made something that she just wanted to eat, and we all wanted to eat it too. If there was an event that transformed me, it was probably going to Timor. If there was an event that seemed to have transformed the space around me, it was this one. The spirit of generosity, the telling of stories, the making of food, the making of art, and the sense that something could happen at that point, pre-Trump era of the United States. It's inspired those people who were there to continue organizing recipe slams, continue telling about food and sharing food and making it for each other at no cost. Whereas we had a $5 cover charge for this so we could pay for the space. And they're going to keep doing it. There's going to be another one of these slams shortly in Denver, Colorado. There's going to be more of these slams incorporated into the DNA of the regional food activists in Portland. And they're just going to keep doing it because it felt good, because it made everybody feel like they liked each other, because it stopped the discussion about politics and turned it back to the local and what matters to here and now. So that was pretty good. And finishing up, Melbourne is sometimes called the Montreal of Australia. I don't know about that, but there are some certain parallels, certain similarities. This is the renovated Docklands area, the old commercial port. This is not similar to Montreal. This is an olive oil producer in Australia. High quality, delicious, amazing olive oil. Who knew? Things to discover. This is maybe a bit more similar to the food ethos of Montreal. There's a lot of humor in Australian food, a great deal of wit and desire to be playful. They're making gin, just like we are in Quebec. Interesting parallels. They're fermenting radishes and serving them fresh with homemade sesame buns and what they call umami butter, butter full of incredible, delicious mouthfeel. And so these things made me think, there's stuff of crazy varieties going on everywhere. There are surprises. There are things that are unexpected. Australia and Melbourne, Canada and Montreal. We often say, oh, we don't have a food culture. We certainly do. We have many. What happens when a food culture is not anchored to a single history? What happens when we come from many places? Individuals who come from many places, and then whole provinces and countries that come from many places. What does that mean in terms of studying food, in terms of trying to anchor it or name it or call it something? That's very difficult, very complex thing to try to simplify. So maybe simplification is not the answer. That was the view I saw on January 1st, 2017. The beginning of the end of the Eco-Gastronomy project. I was back in Montreal. I was eating my own food, my own pickles, my own, what are those, raw cashews. Nice bit of arepa from the Latin American store next door to me. I thought, oh, I'm home. I've gone around the world. I came home again. How can I take all of these stories that I've told, that I've heard, that I will tell again in different ways, how can I anchor them into what I do? Was this project all about me? No. But it did feel very much a personal journey and a personal project. What can that do to inspire us as we go on and keep telling stories? How can that inspire me? Well, I'm doing it right now. So, all of these things are stories, and they're also a part of me. They're now also, in some minor way, part of you. But I hope your stories, all the things that you do, all the places that you've traveled and you've gone to around the world, around the city, around your house, can serve to bring attention in new and exciting ways to your food and to the ways that you practice your food and the ways that you share it with other people and continue to expand and spiral upwards some kind of eco-gastronomic reality for everybody.